Hi, this is Demi Lovato. I'm here to remind you that taking care of your mental health is more important than ever. So many of us are struggling right now and don't know where to turn. That's why Talkspace has made it their mission to make therapy more accessible and affordable for everyone. Therapy has helped me in so many ways, and I wouldn't be where I am without it. Talkspace has made getting the support you need much easier. Take the first step towards feeling better and go to Talkspace.com and connect with a licensed therapist today. Talkspace, therapy for all.
Get $100 off your first month of Talkspace with coupon TURN.
This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and it's never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best way. So, my grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely calloused and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete macho man. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He was also an extreme racist. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because, well, he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very nonsense type of man, though. He also was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope pretty stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mum was born in 1965 and remembers this story clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year it was. Anyway, one summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother and my grandmother were all there and were very excited about this. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for, well, generations, I think. But going into the woods for a fun family activity was pretty much nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt backwoods road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do, after being stuck together like that, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up, and as he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. But before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said that he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of it, since they're all used to the woods, and these woods in particular were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff that they'd brought with them. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be any animal in these woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. But scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. But the mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and also worried about it. but she did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry, I guess you could call it, and just continued playing while avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat, I guess. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange, though. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with a rope and hung high above their heads. Now, a lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed that noose there. My grandmother stopped pretty much dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pick up and leave. John was still out in the woods after all. But even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had now completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman that she is, soothed her children and told them that it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart that they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it like that. At least, sane deer hunter, that is. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a sort of rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people, all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went with a sort of quick pattern, 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was not just getting louder, though. It was definitely getting closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go, get in the car," he yelled. He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave now. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at this moment, too. He was a man afraid of pretty much nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and, as quickly as possible, threw it all in the car. They had no care for the things that they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk and items were broken, and after everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and they drove away. And this is where the main grunt of the story ends, unfortunately. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has just refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he just quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them to not ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is really the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself that I would ask him one day. And now I can't, and regret it greatly. By the time that I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. And this story just doesn't have any answers to go with it. When he died, the only thing that I was sad about was never really knowing what happened that day. What I mean is that we weren't close at all when I got older, and once I'd learned about all of the abuse that he caused, I chose to separate myself from him. His death, though, it looms over me, and his story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood, nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am one of the only people in the family who is still curious about what happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story, it definitely piqued my interest more than any others in my family, which, by the way, this isn't the only strange story from my family, but it's definitely the most strange. In the end, I guess I just wish I had answers, and I hope all of you found this story as fascinating as I did. So, I have to keep this general, but I would really like to share it. Also, before I begin, please keep in mind that I was 22 years old and not even out of grad school when all of this went down. I'm a therapist, and while I was in grad school, I began an internship that provided group and individual counseling to halfway houses. This halfway house was run by a church and their well-meaning congregation, but was a bit of a mess. After several months of working with them, I got a phone call from the house parent that said none of the residents were willing to attend group sessions if their new housemate would be involved. The house parent made some comments about typical house drama, so I wasn't too worried about it, and just told them to go ahead and bring the residents to the clinic, and I would work with the new housemate privately to figure out what was going on. I met with the new housemate first, and they seemed a bit reserved and untrusting, but nice enough. When I asked about the issues in the house, they gave a small curved smile and raspy sort of chuckle or scoff. I pushed them a bit further, but all they said was that the others were scared. We ended our session agreeing to meet weekly. I had the group session next, new housemate not included, to get a feel with what was going on from the others. When I walked in, I could tell that there was something seriously wrong. Their faces looked terrified. Their general appearances were disheveled, and they were all looking anxiously around at each other. I asked what was going on, and nobody answered. They asked me what I thought of the new housemate, and I redirected back to them. The anxious eye contact continued. I asked again and reminded them that change and growth couldn't occur without honesty. And finally, one of them started talking. And here is the story from that perspective. Well, we were told that we were getting a new housemate that we weren't supposed to have much interaction with, and that they wouldn't be there long. No one would give us info about why the new housemate would be getting the only private bedroom, or why they wouldn't be participating in classes or group activities. They just told us to leave them be. This must have gone on for 2 weeks, I think. Then they started letting the new housemate hang out and participate in things. They would make some strange comments that would make us uncomfortable, but we would just ignore them. They wouldn't sleep. They would always leave their bedroom after they thought everyone was asleep, go into our rooms and check to see if we were actually asleep by holding their finger under our nose. Then they would leave and walk through the backwoods. They would always be back in the morning, and we would tell the house parent, but would be told to be quiet and not talk about this with anyone. One night after dinner, we turned on the ID channel, and the new housemate was watching with us. And a few minutes into the episode, and they got up and walked into the woods. They usually did this super late at night, but anyway, a few minutes later, we heard it. Their name in the episode. We couldn't be sure, so we went to the computer and checked and saw that they had tortured and murdered several people. Now, there's more details to the story that I can't share, but needless to say, my new client was a convicted serial killer that had done some very horrible things. This person was being let out on a technicality that affected several of the murders that they were charged with, so got released early on the condition that they lived under supervision. And this particular halfway house was being paid to hold this person until a more appropriate structure was in place. After I had done my research and confirmed myself, I went to my supervisor and professor, and the contract with that particular church and halfway house was immediately terminated. Icing on the cake, though, the next year of my life was just terrible, as I was stalked, my home was invaded, my dog's injured, my house and car vandalized, and survival items that didn't belong to me were found in my attic that made it look like someone had been living there. I would come home and the house would look different than the way that I left it. The police came to my house over a dozen times through that year and did nothing, so my family hired a security team and installed cameras. 6 months later, a perpetrator was arrested on my property, and eyewitnesses and evidence linked him to the crimes. The perpetrator had been out of prison for just over a year on some terrible charges, and you can probably guess who was from the same small hometown as the man arrested. Yep, it was my client. So, I've been living in my house for about 15 years with my mum, dad, and sister. We've had many things happen before, but we just kind of shrugged them off like it wasn't really a big deal. For example, things move on their own, we hear random knocking in the middle of the night, doors open on their own, a clock even flew off the wall once and shattered. But as I said, these aren't really that major of a thing, and they could be explained away. And we weren't really worried about them. So we decided to ask our neighbour if the previous owners had any experiences like this, though, and he told us that yes, in fact they did, and it was the reason that they moved out. The tap would turn on by itself, and the water would keep running until someone noticed it and turned the tap off. They would constantly see people and hear things too. We personally haven't had the water thing happen yet, but we've definitely started seeing figures and hearing people even shout our names when nobody is actually there. But the main thing that happened was that one night at about 4 or 5 in the morning, I was woken up by an extremely loud bang, followed by somebody sprinting down the stairs. My sister rushed into my room because that's where the sound came from, but I pretended to be asleep because I didn't know what to do or how to react to the situation. But as soon as she left the room, I put my phone torch on and I investigated. All I saw was my iPad across the other side of the room. Now, that night before I had went to sleep, I had put my iPad on charge, but I had placed it neatly beside my bed. And then that whole situation happened later that night, so what was the explanation? Maybe the fuse popped, or maybe the charger overheated or something? But I checked the wire, I checked everything, and nothing was damaged or burnt or anything. So you might say that I was dreaming, but this can't be true either because me, my dad and my sister all heard the loud bang in the running. My mum was too deep in her sleep to have heard it though. So the next morning we all talk about it and we pretty much were just spooked out. My dad told me to record my bedroom, but I feel like if I had seen something on my video, I just wouldn't be able to sleep in my room or be in my room anymore. But since then, nothing major has happened. We see figures walking about from the corner of our eyes, we hear people shouting our names, things move, we hear knocking, but nothing is compared to what happened that night, and we still don't have an explanation for whatever that was.
Hi, this is Demi Lovato. I'm here to remind you that taking care of your mental health is more important than ever. So many of us are struggling right now and don't know where to turn. That's why Talkspace has made it their mission to make therapy more accessible and affordable for everyone. Therapy has helped me in so many ways, and I wouldn't be where I am without it. Talkspace has made getting the support you need much easier. Take the first step towards feeling better and go to Talkspace.com and connect with a licensed therapist today. Talkspace, therapy for all.
Get $100 off your first month of Talkspace with coupon TURN.
After high school many years ago, I was in a really bad place. My guardian had kicked me out after graduation. She didn't help me find a place to stay, so I lived in my car for a couple of months. I met some heavy metal dudes at work one day, and I'd seen them around town. All of my other friends knew who they were. Everyone loved them. We became friends over a couple of months, and they offered for me to move in with them. I agreed. Looking back now, man, do I wish I just stayed in that car. My two main roommates were brothers named Andrew and Seth. They were in a band. They also believed in, a cult and anything of that sort. I never really personally believed in that stuff, but I'm not one to tell someone what they should believe. They had to let me live with them rent-free for several months, so who was I to complain? Being the only female in a house full of young men, though, I was always sort of looking over my shoulder. I mean, you never know who you can trust, right? It turns out, I was very right to worry as well. So over some time, their friends started to stay with us for longer periods of time, sometimes weeks in fact. Their friends were another group of brothers that they had gone to school with. There were 5 brothers in total, but only 2 ever stayed with us consistently. The younger brother, Mark, was very polite. He cleaned up after himself and always helped with the household chores and whatnot. The other brother, Adam, had a laundry list of mental problems. He had apparently done some, bad drugs back in the day or something, and it had developed into what seemed like psychosis of the religious sort. He had actually done time in prison for assaulting a woman with a Bible. He would often look you in the eyes and tell you that he could see how you would die. Once he told me that I was possessed by a demon and I needed to cleanse my soul. Everyone in the house knew that he had these problems, but he was their friend. They helped him through the hard times and gave him a place to stay. Otherwise, he would be on the streets. I was always on guard around him, though, after the things that he told me. Nobody else seemed to be as concerned as I was, but they should have been. Because one day, I was sleeping and my phone rang. It was my boss. He asked if I could come into work an hour early. It was only 12 p.m. and I was broke and had nothing better to do, so I said yes. I got up and began getting ready to leave, and I walked out into the living room to see Mark and Andrew sitting on the couch, while Adam sat on the floor by the TV. He was watching scripture videos on YouTube or something, some real end-of-day stuff. And that was fairly common for him, though, so I just went about my business. I said goodbye, and then I left for work. My shift at work was almost complete, too, when the phone rang. My boss answered, handing the phone to me and said, "For you." I was just a cashier, so I assumed it was a friend that couldn't reach me on my phone or something. I answered the phone, and I heard a man's voice that I didn't recognize. "Hi, this is Detective Williams. Listen, something happened at your apartment today, and we need you to come to the station to talk about it." I left work immediately. I had assumed one of the brothers had been arrested for drug dealing or something. I was very wrong about that, but I got to the station and I was buzzed in. An officer escorted me to a small cold room with a camera. He gave me a bottle of water and left me by myself for about 30 minutes. My mind was racing, thinking about what could have happened. But he came back in and informed me that Adam had actually stabbed and killed Andrew at around 1 p.m. To say that I was shocked was an understatement. I mean, I just left the house an hour before it happened and everything seemed fine. I asked if there had been a fight, and the detective informed me that there hadn't been a fight, and it seemed to have happened just out of nowhere. I gave my statement to the police, and I left with nowhere to go, still in shock and confused out of my mind. Our apartment was now a crime scene, so I just went to another friend's house to watch the news report, since the police wouldn't give me any information on the case. And over the next couple of days, the information began to be released. And it was true. Adam hadn't just stabbed Andrew once, not twice, but he had stabbed him over and over and nearly decapitated the guy. After the murder, he ran down the road apparently, still holding the murder weapon. He called 911 and informed them what he had done. I sat there and just watched the news report in absolute horror. We had known that he was unstable, but this? He had fully confessed to the brutal murder as well and provided police with all of his notebooks and stuff and just anything that he could. And he had apparently been planning to murder all of his brothers, my roommates, and even me. He honestly thought that we were possessed by demons and this was the only way to free us. Luckily, none of his other intended victims were home that day, but Mark unfortunately witnessed the murder. Luckily he escaped, but if I hadn't have got that call from my boss that day, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't be alive today. When I was in 3rd grade, my mother and I lived with my grandparents because my mum and dad had just divorced. My mum worked in a factory and she worked long hours, so I had to take the school bus. The walk to the bus stop was kind of long. I had to walk down this path to the end and wait by myself as well. And one day, I was standing there and a man in a silver car drove slowly by me, just staring the whole time. I dismissed it as nothing in my 8-year-old mind. I mean, it wasn't anything to worry about. That was until he had turned around and crept back by. This happened several times too, until he finally stopped on the side of the road and started to get out of his car and walk towards me. I ran like a bat out of hell back to my grandparents' house, crying hysterically to my grandma. She called the police and gave them the small amount of information that I could remember. The best part of that day was that my grandma made me cookies and milk and called me out of school. For the rest of the time that we lived there, though, my grandma would always walk me to the bus stop and wait until I was safely on that bus. They never did catch this guy, but I hope that man never took another kid, and I'm very grateful for my mother and the fact that she told me about stranger danger all the time. When I was a child, my family often spent the weekends or the holidays at my grandmother's house. As a typical traditional Malay house, the house was made of wood and pretty big. Not a surprise though, since my father does have a lot of siblings, 9 of them in total. But it wasn't just my immediate family. Most weekends or holidays, even my uncles and aunt will be there too long with their family. Sometimes there will be around 50 to 70 of us inside this house, in fact. It was truly one of the fondest memories where the entire huge family would sit together to have dinner or celebrate birthdays and whatnot. And generally it was just a really great time. One day though, my grandmother, she fell sick. The doctor simply told us that her health was deteriorating since she was pretty old at that time, but didn't require hospitalization at that point. My dad and his siblings all made up their mind that my grandmother should stay with them. Every month she'll stay with one of her children's houses, and I remember she stayed the most at my house since it was the biggest at the time. I was honestly happy since she was a great storyteller and also a great cook. In the meantime, my father and uncles hired a nearby neighbor to take care of and clean my grandmother's house every once in a while. Unfortunately though, her health continues to decline. She told my father that she wants to stay in her old home. At first, we didn't really like the idea, with her being alone in that house, especially with her declining health. But after a lot of discussion, my eldest uncle decided to build a house directly in front of my grandmother's house to stay. In the meantime, they'll rent a nearby house so he and my cousins could visit her every day. My father and his siblings also agreed to hire a nanny for my grandmother so she won't be alone. Fortunately too, despite no one having stayed in the house for about 2 years to this point, the house was relatively clean. Now, it had been almost probably about a week since my grandmother returned to her own house. The weekend was coming up though, and my father decided to bring back the tradition of staying at my grandmother's. That Friday night, around maybe 20 of us were there, I think. And it was that night that strange things began to happen. The first to notice something was off were my cousins. They were all the daughters of Dad's youngest sibling. They were always cheerful, but at that time, I just remember their faces were almost terrified all the time. I just chalked it up to kids being kids, which was kind of ironic since I was around 10 at the time. But then, as I walked past their bedroom, I heard through the thin wall that the girls complained to their parents that they noticed a few shadowy figures had been all over the house. My uncle tried to convince them that it was just their imagination. I decided not to care much since I was just too tired and sleepy. But that night, while I was sleeping, I remember waking up and staring above, and I saw something that I'll never forget. Just so you know, too, a traditional Malay house rarely has a ceiling in the first place. The house beam was exposed, and you can see the inside layer of the roof. And during my sudden awaking, I saw something like a shadow sitting at the house beam. I had to rub my eyes to see, and after a while, I sort of could make out what it was. It was a creature or something. I thought to myself at first, am I still dreaming? I was pretty terrified, but I could definitely see something there, but it was like my brain was failing to see exactly what it looked like. What I mean by this is that sometimes it sort of looked like maybe a lion or then a crocodile or something, and then it would sort of switch to a huge bird or something else. But then it looked at me, and all I remember were its huge red eyes and a huge wide grin filled with teeth. It was at this point too that I tried to scream my lungs out, but my voice stuck at my throat and my body felt stiff like I was paralyzed. All I could do in the end was slowly pull up the blanket and hide my body underneath it and try and force myself back to sleep, hoping that the whole thing was just a nightmare or something. The next day, I simply sat alone at the stairs trying to get rid of the memories of what happened and process the whole event. And from the corner of my eye, I could sense that someone or something had been peeking around from the toilet area, looking at the living room. It looks as if it was a child, or simply the size of a child anyway, with sort of pale grey skin. Again, too, at first, I just thought it was my imagination, but it happened throughout the day and the nights, and then I heard my aunts talking with each other, and it turns out that I wasn't the only one who noticed it, because apparently the entire family had seen it. Or rather, we could only see it out of the corner of our eyes, but when we all tried to turn to look at it directly, it just simply disappeared. Some people as well decided to check it out themselves, and yet there was always nothing there. My uncle quietly told us one day, though, that when a house was abandoned for too long, there's always something that tends to move in. The house was abandoned for about 2 years before this, so obviously something had come in, and now it felt like we were all simply the intruders. He told us that if we didn't bother them, that they shouldn't bother us. That night we all prayed together as well as recited some holy prayers, and yet I could still see this little stalker, and I was beginning to notice a few shadows around the house that didn't belong to the furniture or the stuff in there. Worse for me, though, was that night. I had woken up again. This time, this thing was already grinning at me, with what I assumed the hand poking my cheek this time. It was a really weird sensation too, because it didn't feel solid at all. It almost felt more like a cloud of smoke sort of brushing up against me. Again, I tried to scream, but my body felt stiff. Like before, I could only slowly pull up my blanket to cover my head and force myself to sleep, but I didn't dare to sleep at that house ever again after that. In fact, every time we went back to my grandmother's house during either weekends or holidays, I would simply choose to stay at my uncle's house that was right in front of it. But every time I entered that house, I could still sense this small figure poking out its head from the toilet wall, or the shadows that would move around the house just all over the place. My grandmother passed away around 8 years ago, and since then we have just never had a reason to stay at that house ever again. The house was downsized as well while I was at university, but it still has the original layout of the lower area and whatnot. They only got rid of the upper area, in other words. I asked my father too one day why he didn't simply just demolish the entire building and start again. And he then told me that even getting rid of the upper area was difficult, because workers apparently were being pushed by nothing, and electronics and engines were always malfunctioning, and in the end they just decided not to touch the bottom area and just use it as storage.